I'm going to talk today about some kind of historical sort of context or framework for the day's convenings. And so when it comes to financial capability and asset building, home ownership has been widely regarded as the primary asset owned by most Americans and a driver of wealth accumulation in our free market private property economy. And for particularly African Americans, the question that's sort of posed today about financial capability and asset building is as old as Black freedom itself. What I mean by that is that even as African Americans possess zero net wealth coming out of slavery, efforts at asset building and financial capacity by the 4 million formerly enslaved persons began almost at the moment of emancipation. Now, the single most important financial institution in Black life was the Freedmen's Savings and Trust, or the Freedmen's Bank, established in 1865. Now, embracing the politics of thrift and uplift, Blacks put their very modest earnings into the newly created bank. And within 10 years, the bank amassed deposits of more than $1.5 billion in today's sort of numbers. And for context, today there's not a single Black-owned bank that manages a depository institution's assets over $1 billion. And for this number of 1.5 billion, we have to go to the top 3 or 4 Black-owned financial institutions, Black-owned banks. Now, despite Blacks parking their monies in the most conservative of investments, savings and trust depository institution, Black account holders would see their savings vanish. And let me just say this parenthetically, they would park their monies into that institution because at the admonishment of political leaders and financial leaders who urged them and admonished them to do so, to save and be engaged in thrift. But as they parked their money into this most conservative of investments, they would see their savings vanish as bank managers and board of directors, primarily or exclusively really white, privately invested the free person's savings into high-risk speculative ventures. And with the account holders fleeced, the bank would close its doors in 1870s. Now, this sort of white-collar criminality at the heart of the Freedmen's Bank did not deter Blacks from the aim of property ownership. In the 1870s, with whites having sort of owning nearly sort of twice as much homes, or having nearly twice as much home ownership as African Americans, Blacks would work to close this home ownership gap. And hopefully, this slide is up. You can see the slide, which sort of provides a sort of longitudinal sort of look at Black and white home ownership. So as this longitudinal sort of slide shows, the racial home ownership gap shrunk some 26% from the 1870s to the 2000s. Yet, on closer inspection, it reveals that all but one of that closure occurred between the period of Reconstruction and the turn of the 20th century. So that means that from 1900s or 1900 to 2007, for over 100 years, the racial home ownership gap shrunk merely 1%, when in one generation, or over 30 years, it had shrunk 25%. So the question is, in part, what happened in the 20th century, in Luce's American century, as Henry Luce once called it? What happened in ostensibly the best century for home ownership? Throughout the first half of the 20th century, you see a series of policies and practices which severely curb Blacks' access to capital, or strip the limited access to capital that Blacks did have. Now, the most infamous and consequential of these race-based credit rationings was, of course, residential redlining. Laws such as the National Housing Act of 1935, which established a sort of Federal Housing Administration, and loan facilitators such as the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which worked closely alongside the local real estate boards and lenders, would nationalize appraisals and expand home buying. And these public-private partnerships at the local, state, and federal levels expanded home ownership largely through the subsidized mortgage loan program, program that amortized mortgages while requiring a house down payment that was only a fraction of the costs that existed prior to the passage of the laws in the 1930s. However, in this process, would-be Black borrowers were systematically excluded from all these subsidies that were essential to the making of the white middle class. Now, meanwhile, other laws such as the GI Bill in the 1940s and the National Interstate Defense Highways Act in the 1950s exacerbated the asset divide. The GI Bill, for instance, provided low-interest loans with little to no down payment for white veterans. For example, if you wanted to buy a property, a house in Levittown community, a white veteran might be able to purchase that house for as little as $1 down. But local lenders regularly refused Black veterans because lenders did not offer mortgages in Black communities, which were, according to redlining, high-risk lending areas. And moreover, lenders were encouraged not to violate the, quote, racially heterogeneous guidelines of the FHA. In other words, interracial integrated neighborhoods were excluded from the FHA subsidies. Meanwhile, the National Interstate Defense Highway Act built federal highways that dissected Black and brown communities and effectively choked off consumer investment capital in neighborhoods of color, thereby capping, if not further depreciating, the property values of these homeowners of color. Now, had affirmative action for whites merely stopped at mortgage lending, the wealth and asset building gap would have been significant enough, but it continued in virtually all aspects of home ownership. See, for the relatively few Blacks who were able to purchase homes, they became targets of assessment for property taxes at the time of purchase, yet their homes were underappraised when it became time to sell. For these and other reasons, by 1960, again, as the chart shows, the home ownership gap grew to its widest margin since emancipation. Yet, it was at this nadir in 1960 that we actually begin to see glimpses of the gap closing. It closed in no small part due to international pressure. Now, amid the civil rights movement, also known as the Second Reconstruction, the Soviet Union looked to exploit very real domestic race relation tensions with the morally economic stain of white supremacy splattered on the US. And they did so by raising fundamental questions about the compatibility of democratic capitalism with racial equality and justice. And they did so in the US, as well as raising these questions about deracialized system of democratic capitalism, and if it could ever coexist in newly independent, non-aligned nation states in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And the question becomes, at the moment, who would win these hearts and minds? The US or Soviet economic systems, capitalism, or communism? It was in this geopolitical context of the Cold War of the 1960s, coinciding with pressure from below during the mass protest phase of the civil rights movement, that spurred policymakers in particular to begin to address issues of political and economic inequality. Now, to be sure, the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act were significant legislative achievements with measurable results. The Civil Rights Act of '64 and the Voting Rights Act of '65 would collectively narrow education, employment, and income gaps between whites and Blacks in the South, for instance. Yet, these acts were insufficient in addressing the knottier problems of wealth building. After all, as valuable as education, employment, and income might be, they are non-transferable assets and cannot be passed on to the next generations the way in which wealth can. So it was in 1968, for instance, where the Poor People's Campaign, led by Martin Luther King and others, saw it that financial capacity of Blacks was being undermined by a lack of access to capital, which they argued was necessary to exercise full citizenship in the US. And this Poor People Campaign signaled a shift in many ways from a focus on civil rights and political rights to foregrounding economic justice. So in the 1970s, this expression of economic justice would take the form in many ways of democratizing credit for heretofore populations traditionally excluded from conventional consumer financial markets. Now, in the 70s, policymakers seem to genuinely try to expand consumer financial opportunities to historically disenfranchised populations. And this effort to encourage financial services participation in underserved communities was evinced in a series of mid-70s legislation that included laws such as the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, and the 1977 Community Reinvestment Act. However, even this credit expansion was countered. And this significance is in the distinction between home ownership and an equity building. And the foremost example is that owning a home can be a means of wealth building, for instance, but not if the equity in the house is eroded or stripped out through fees or high cost loans or various forms of predation, financial predation. At almost the same time, we see as the democratization of credit in the 1970s, there also emerged a raft of policies and public actions, beginning particularly in the 1980s, that served to minimize government oversight of the financial sector. And it was this toxic alchemy, the expansion of credit on one hand in the 1970s, followed almost immediately by a generation or more of erosion of consumer protections on the other, that produced a recipe for intergenerational predation and financial abuse. Now, many other products considered predatory or high cost in recent years were established at the time. And we know these sundry financial products such as subprime mortgage loans or higher cost expansion of student loans, whose rapid spread in the post-secondary educational sector is directly tied to the deregulatory desire to shift costs and accountability away from institutions and onto the backs of those individuals with the fewest resources to pay or to push back. And in my book, which Dr. McClendon referenced, in my book, Land of the Free, I look at how traditionally reliable conveyance for mobility have been compromised in recent decades, further eroding the ability to build equity and wealth for many Americans, but particularly for African Americans, and not only in the areas of home loans, but also student loans, in areas of housing and employment, and in education, and what connects us to home and school and work, transportation, and things like auto insurance. Now, in conclusion, let me sort of say that today, unlike a century ago, asset building seems less about racial exclusion than the higher cost of financial inclusion for Blacks and other historically disenfranchised populations, as racialized credit rationing has made its return to places like the American mortgage market. Though in other ways, the high cost of financial inclusion may just represent the most recent form of wealth extraction, one with echoes of white-collar criminality, transferring financial resources from communities of color with a history as old as Black freedom itself. This is the current world in which we now occupy. And I look forward to speakers and presenters today interrogating these and other issues. And I'll stop there and leave my further remarks for Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Devin. You covered so much information over in such a little bit of time. So anyone who has questions, please add them to the chat, and I will be monitoring that chat to pose your questions to Devin. But while I'm waiting for you to propose questions, I have a comment and 2 questions I'd like to respond to, if you don't mind, Devin. The comment is that all of those trends and errors and history that you documented always kind of leaves themselves in the stories of real people, right? And so anytime there was someone who lost money at the Freedman Bank, their children and grandchildren probably heard about that and maybe don't trust banks. Just like the children and grandchildren of people who were mistreated in the Tuskegee experiment, they don't trust hospitals.
Exactly.
And so I just kind of wanted to make the statement, I guess, the comment that even though you talked about trends and stats and kind of historical references, real people were hurt by these things, and those real people are passing those stories down to their children. You have to overcome some of those stories and that emotional angst as you try to get people to participate openly and fully in our financial system today. So I just wanted to make that kind of comment.
No, absolutely, 100% right. I mean, I think there's a whole body of work that could be done on financial trauma. and the ways in which it passes down from one generation to another. And we've seen this in many ways in the general literature in terms of the impact that the Great Depression has had on generations, frankly. But you're absolutely right, absolutely right. Even and just to make a further point, even in the 1930s, Black community was admonishing themselves. Remember what happened during the Freedmen's Bank. So passed down from generation to generation during the period of the Great Depression, absolutely.
And since you're a historian, this is a question I've always had, so I'm going to ask you your opinion on this. So I've heard about some of the things that happened in the 1860s. So right after emancipation, right with the Freedmen's Bureau, right with the possibility of 40 acres of the mule that came but didn't really come. Some people got the Homestead Act, but Blacks didn't get very much, and sometimes what they got was taken away. And also, you know, what happened with Reconstruction and what didn't. So I just wanted to kind of have you think back to 1860 to 1870 and kind of do a counterfactual. So if one or two things didn't happen the way it did, how could the 4 million emancipated slaves maybe had a better financial footing than they ended up having? You can think of one or two things that, you know, didn't go right. If they'd been done a little differently, might have made a big difference in the financial lives of African Americans.
Wonderful question, Trina, excellent question. And I'm going to sort of tie this into what seems to be an emerging theme. I think Dean McKay mentioned it, and certainly Dr. McClendon mentioned it. That issues of voting. And so it's impossible to separate out Blacks' economic security from their political security. And so what happens in the early part of Reconstruction, even 1860s, early 1870s, there is a kind of debate of whether Blacks should pursue, in the 1880s, 1890s really as well, whether Blacks should pursue political, economic gains and objectives. And what happened was, as Blacks' political rights eroded, what eventually occurred is Blacks' economic security eroded. And so political security was critical. And here I'm talking about the rise of Black electoral disfranchisement. If you're unable to protect your property legally, your property is easily seized upon. And there have been scholars, Betsy Herbert Triant's work, for instance, threatening property, who sort of alludes to this. Andrew Carl's work, the ways in which Black property gets seized and taken. Thomas Mitchell's sort of research about the seizure of Black lands. Because Blacks don't have their political rights, what ends up happening is that their property gets expropriated and taken and seized. And we can have this story about Black, but we also see it in other spaces of color. Look at what happens in the Pacific Islands, for instance, in places like Hawaii, frankly, roughly around this sort of same time period. And so, so my answer would be, if the security of political rights had occurred, the economic rights of Blacks would have been much better off.
Thank you. So we have a question here. What are your thoughts on the growing single-family residences as a new investment class for owners of capital, private equity groups? This is creating permanent renter class as prices inflate out of reach. So kind of what's happening with family residents, private equity group, who owns and have the right to purchase homes and who don't, who's renters and who's not. So if you can kind of answer that question.
Sure, no, good question. I'm more of a historian, it's more of a contemporary question. So what I would in part sort of say is that there's certainly been, I think, questions raised even among historians about the value and validity of home ownership and the trade-offs between home ownership and renting. And at some level, what you would like to see is maybe tax credits and tax breaks for renters, frankly, and really greater sort of regulatory oversight of the rise of private equity markets, frankly, and private equity firms. And we see this not simply in essence of residential spaces and whether the purchasing of foreclosed properties, as we saw in the aftermath of the Great Recession, or even right now in the period of COVID, the ways in which the private equity market has often driven up prices in healthcare, frankly. And so I think the greater question would be a greater regulatory sort of oversight of this private equity market, which really gets to the question of the rise of financialization in the American economy, which I think is the big question that lures over all of this, frankly.
Thank you. Another question that has arisen from our audience: what are your thoughts about the subject of reparations for African Americans?
Oh, wonderful question. I mean, in fact, actually, I'm double dipping today. I'm also part of a organization called ASALA, Association of African American Study of Life and History, which is the oldest Black, really academic professional organization in the country. It was founded by Carter G. Woodson, the famous founder of Black History Month. And ASALA actually has their virtual conference taking place this month. And today they're going to have an evening session on the issue of reparations. And so that's going to be, just a plug for ASALA, where I'm also on a program committee member of, and I'll be on there doing a lot of things for them. When you leave the events this evening, please tune into ASALA. Again, a panel on reparations. So that's a plug for ASALA and the reparations sort of work that they're unpacking and interrogating. And so, reparations has been a long and studied sort of issue and subject matter. It's increasingly gained traction, I think. And we've seen efforts at some measures of reparations, at least locally, in places maybe like Asheville, North Carolina. We sort of talked about the need for reparations. The question about reparations in many ways goes back to the questions of the political will and political context that exists at the moment. But I'll say this, at least historically, I've been surprised about the ways in which reparations have gained sort of traction in recent years. So it's been an issue which has been a movement which has been long in the making, dating back to the 19th century, frankly.
Thank you. Another question from Matthew. On the whole, would you say that the financialization of every aspect of American life is net good or net bad? Or is that just too simplistic a framework?
I mean, we, that's a, I would sort of say I would go with choice C, which is in part too simplistic, but not. I mean, I understand the question and need for clarity. And I would sort of say that it's not necessarily the financialization of the global economy, because it's not just the American economy, right? And so I'm also a visiting professor in the UK in a town called Newcastle, where there's a bank in Newcastle, Northern Rock, which was the first bank to collapse in during the Great Recession in the UK. It was the first British collapse of a financial institution in over 150 years. They did not experience the collapses that we had even during the Great Depression. Why? Not because they engaged in subprime loans necessary for British homeowners and borrowers, but because they're so heavily invested in the subprime mortgage market in the US. So the financialization is something which is an integrated market geopolitically and globally. So what I would sort of say is the financialization is fine and good, but what gives me pause and caution is the absence of a countervailing political economic sort of system of force. And that absence, and here I'm talking in many ways just intellectually scholarly, the absence of a countervailing political economic sort of system means that there's no check and balance on financialization. And that becomes deeply problematic, I think, geopolitically. And to get back to your very, very important question, I mean, friends and I, we always talk about how do we drive these abstract concepts down to the ground for real folk to understand them, right? And that's right. And so the globalization of financial economy means real material things for Black folk and Black lives. it means perhaps the increase in gas prices. It means the increase in food on the shelf for people who are trying to make a living, right? It means an increase in costs on utilities, right? And so the rise of things like excessive speculation in the commodities market inflates the cost in the real lives of real people every day, right? And that's because of financialization of the economy, the lack of accountability, so the political economic system. So that's in part how I sort of answer that question.
Thank you.
Yes.
Another question. Besides trauma and the resulting distrust of mainline financial services, were there any alternative financial services available to Blacks, in addition to the bank you mentioned, in the 30, 40 years during and after Reconstruction? And were any run by Black financiers?
Yeah, no, yeah, certainly there were definitely Black financial institutions, Black banks, which emerged in places like Chicago mostly. Ironically, surprisingly, really not in New York, in many ways because these Black financial institutions got crowded out. And so there's a wonderful book written many years ago by, I would say, Mara Stewart, and Stuart, Mara, M-E-R-A-H, looking at the rise of financial institutions, particularly insurance companies, right, in U.S. history. And Stewart actually coins the phrase of economic detours. And that phrase, economic detours, basically is that because Blacks don't have access to normal routes of capital, that they find themselves quarantined as both as consumers, but also as businesses. And so it creates this sort of quarantine sort of market for Blacks as consumers and as businesses. And this also creates moments of possibilities of predation. So frankly, and so, I mean, when you have a quarantine market, you can charge prices as high as you want. And we see this in the creation of the Black America, the Black world's most famous community, Harlem, right? Where rental prices are through the roof. Why? Because you can't move to a place like Queens or elsewhere, right? So you have a quarantine rental market, right? A quarantine market anyway is going to inflate the prices. And so we see this in the financial sector, we see this in residential renting elsewhere. Yes. Yes. Yeah, and there's a wonderful book written called The Color of Money by Mirza Baradaran. And so it's a wonderful book written by Mirza. Yeah, excellent.
Excellent, thank you. There was another comment earlier that I didn't say. If you have research on trauma and financial capability, can you link it or put your research in an email in the chat so people can follow that? So maybe not now while you're talking, but once this session ends, maybe add some of those resources or some links to the chat. Is that something you might be able to do?
Well, no, I mean, no, what I was saying is that it's a great area of research. I've not done any research on it, but it is, I think, a valuable space for young scholars or graduate students, new directions for research. You know, Trina, how these, when you write a literature review, right, where the scholarship should go, right? I think it's ripe for research, absolutely. I've not done any research on it myself.
So for those of you who do research or for FCAB as a whole, thinking about this idea of financial trauma and how it relates to people of color might be something ripe for new research, exactly, or a better lit review if it does exist in the past. So thank you for that great suggestion for people who are looking for topics.
Precisely.
So there is nothing new, I think, in the questions and the chat. We have, I guess, 5 minutes more for this session. So if anybody does have questions, please add. But if there's anything you want to say, yep.
Yeah, while people cue the questions, I will have to say one thing that I didn't add in my presentation, frankly, that I mean, I think these issues are really coming to a head within the next generation or so, because there's a convergence. What we see is that, I mean, this massive extraction of wealth from communities of color, and these communities are color are the fastest populations, the fastest growing populations in the US. Right? And there's certainly been research by Brookings and others about the ways in which we're moving toward, not simply moving toward a race plural America, but moving toward a race plural middle class. And what does it mean if that middle class is, which has historically been relied upon as the backbone for entitlement spending, infrastructure, defense, public education, right? If that middle class, which is increasingly people of color, sees themselves and becomes targets of wealth extraction as they've increasingly become. And what does that mean for things like retirement savings, right? If we hollow out the fastest growing segment of our society, the American middle class, I think that is a critical question that America sort of faces and is yet to grapple with, frankly.
Okay, we have, I think, 2 more questions, and maybe that will be it, but depending on if you want to say more. So one question is, a person might say that Black, Indigenous people of color and those communities have received more subprime mortgages during the global financial crisis because they were riskier borrowers. I had a colleague say this to me. I realize this is a response that doesn't see the systems as to why or even if Black and Indigenous people of color are more likely to be risky and vulnerable. Are there any thoughts on the argument that there's simply more risky investments for banks?
Sure. I mean, and there were both HUD and I want to say Fed Reserve studies that came out in the early mid 2000s, indicating things like subprime equity loans, for instance, that what these equity lenders were looking for were people who were bad financial risks, people who actually had built equity in their properties. And so equity, again, subprime equity lenders were targeting people who were not bad financial risk, people who actually had built equity and built. Right? So again, it belies a sort of stereotype and popular perception. Also, too, by the apex of 2006, the average subprime borrower was actually eligible for a prime loan, and so I'm going to sort of take this narrative, this story a bit too, Trina, outside of pure home ownership, right? Taking the things like business loan and business lending. And what we see now in the PPP issue with COVID, the shuttering of Black businesses because they're unable to get access to capital, right? Links directly to the lack of equity for Black homeowners, because the main way in which small businesses fund their business is often through the equity that they have in the house and home, right? And that equity is used to both fund business as well as to get loans. Research has been done by various organizations, academic institutions too, that indicate that Black borrowers and women borrowers as well are treated materially differently by business lenders as they seek loans than the white borrower. And so even if you have the same sort of credit score and equity, you bring that same to the table, you're treated differently. And this again go back under the label of trauma too. And by treated differently, I mean from the moment you walk in the door, who's greeted, who's feeling accepted, who's feeling embraced, who's offered financial options and meetings, right? As opposed to who say we're unavailable, or the person you meet is unavailable, right? From every aspect and moment of that financial encounter, Black business owners who are eligible for these loans are treated differently. This was supposed to change with the Dodd-Frank Act of 2010. Section 1071, right, calls for more transparency in the small business lending market, but it doesn't exist, right? So you could be a would-be homeowner, you could be a small Black business. Again, the disparate treatment is there both, regardless of one's credit score or credit profile, I should say.
Thank you. And then final question from Sarah Richards. Given the historical context, you have recommendations for anti-racist financial programs and systems in the present and the future. And how do you see fields like social work contributing to this change?
Oh, that's a mouthful. That's a big question. I'm going to sort of say that what I'm looking forward to most today is some of the workshops and panels actually dealing with these sorts of questions. So I've laid out a historical sort of framework for this discussion. As far as offering of economic packages in the future or currently, I mean, there are sundry ones, but I will sort of say this, that so much of the problem, as I see, at least as a historian, the research that I did in my book, Land of Defeat, comes from the infusion of financial interests in the political and policy process. And if there's some way and that's one of the, I'd say the material of major differences between now and then in some way. I mean, my talk was about the Gilded Age, some level, the first Gilded Age but now we're living through a second Gilded Age. And so how do you push back and regulate these financial interests, which shape and deform conversations and policymaking, and where people whose interests are most at stake are not even in the room to make those decisions? That was the basic question with subprime, right? There were financial interests in the room who were making decisions that had impact on Black people, and Black homeowners were not even in the room to have those discussions. It's one thing when you're a stakeholder in the process. It's completely different when you're outside that process completely.